This is a Stories to be Told podcast. Hi everyone, Tracy DW, back again for another episode of Stories to be Told, the podcast series. Welcome back to the second part of my learning journey called Where is Afghanistan? 20 years ago, 2 weeks later. In my previous podcast episode, I talked about the historical significance of Afghanistan in relation to Britain's colonial past. In this episode, I'll use my learning journey to look at the current situation in Afghanistan in light of recent history since World War II, and again, share some of my own perspectives on how a society, which took 20 years to establish, disappeared in only 2 weeks. As I said previously, the historical and significance of Afghanistan cannot be underestimated in world politics, trade and economics. This part of the Silk Road route has become one of the richest mining areas for rare earth minerals in the world. Afghanistan is rich in zinc and lithium, which is essential for the making of microchip technology. Precious metal, such as gold, can also be mined, as well as iron, lead, oil and gas. Afghanistan is also a major exporter of opium from growing poppies and contributes to almost 40% of the world's opium trade. Some of this opium constitutes as legal use for pharmaceutical products, while much of it is also sold on through black markets. Afghanistan's political influence has also continued to shape Western foreign policy, particularly since the end of World War II and in the decades after World War II from 1946 to 1992. Up until 1939, the only British colonies to have gained independence was the US, as the 13 colonies in 1776, Australia in 1901, Canada initially in 1887 and then through the Statute of Westminster in 1939, and South Africa initially in 1934 and then later in 1961. But Afghanistan had also acquired independent status as a sovereign nation in 1919 through the efforts of their then ruler Amanullah Khan, whom I mentioned in my previous episode. Now, I think it's important to note that by the end of World War II, apart from the US, Canada, Australia and South Africa, Afghanistan was one of 3 other countries situated in the Middle East that had their sovereign status as an independent nation. And the other 2 countries were Egypt in 1922 and Iraq in 1932. And I think that this is really important to note, that those 3 countries are all situated in the Middle East. Now, this reminds me of my first real history lesson as an 8-year-old, listening to Mr. MacDonald in my junior school. Who is Mr. MacDonald, you may ask? You can listen to my podcast episode, A Moment That Changed My Life, to find out more about my early experiences of learning about history. During World War II, Afghanistan made the decision to support the Axis powers, Germany, Italy and Japan, and this must have been a bitter pill to swallow for Britain due to Afghanistan being a former British colony, as well as its proximity to India, which was at the time Britain's most significant colonial asset. Its economic and political significance has made it a target for control of the world's superpowers, and this attention has contributed to the country's instability and internal problems with its own government and infrastructure. After World War II, a Cold War developed between the 2 rising superpowers as the US and the then Soviet Union. The Soviet Union gained control over many Eastern European countries, and Stalin encouraged communist parties in these countries to eliminate all political opposition, starting in Albania in 1949 and ending with Czechoslovakia in 1948. Together with Poland, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, these countries were then referred to as the Eastern Bloc, hidden under the veil of the Iron Curtain, a metaphor for communism and how its grip on these countries formed a physical barrier between the USSR and the rest of Western Europe, including Britain. This also included the division of Germany into East and West, as well as the division of its capital city, Berlin. I remember my trip to West Berlin as a young 12-year-old musician representing my school on a visit at the time. I will make a plan to visit Berlin one day, and hopefully I'll be able to do this in the not too distant future. It's ironic that the very ideology that the Soviet Union had allied with Britain and the US to prevent from spreading across Europe, it had now utilised to build a kind of protective empire and insulator for itself. Britain's allies during the war were predominantly the US, the Soviet Union and China, who were the founders of the coalition in 1941 that eventually became the United Nations or the UN. So what were Stalin's reasons for encouraging communism to then spread? What were his key motives and how was he able to achieve this? Again, looking at the current relationships between East and West across the world today presents another irony, as enemies often become friends in order to defeat a common enemy, protect their own shared interests, and through ideologies establish their own agendas. World War II also enabled the US to establish a powerful economy, and it wanted to trade with countries across the world, especially with Britain's colonies. The Cold War wasn't a physical war, but a metaphor for the animosity between the US and the Soviet Union, and the political propaganda that these two nations espoused about each other to the rest of the world. However, the consequences of the Cold War played out through physical proxy wars in other countries. The most significant being the Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975, and the Soviet Union invasion and occupation of Afghanistan during the Afghan War, 1979 to 1989. Now, in this second war, the US tried to counter the Soviet Union's activities in Afghanistan by supporting the Afghan rebels in order to prevent communism from spreading further. A direct consequence of this was Afghanistan becoming a hotbed for secret intelligence gathering and training. The US formed the CIA and the Soviet Union formed the KGB. And both superpowers, through their separate entities, used their agents to constantly track, trace, intercept and collect information about each other in order to counter any military threats that they may impose upon each other's domestic and international interests. The Cold War created tension between the Soviet Union and Britain with the rest of Western Europe, and also saw the increase in the manufacturing of nuclear warheads. Both superpowers almost came to blows, and the world nearly ended as we knew it when the US intercepted intelligence about the Soviets' plan to store nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba, who were also an ally of the Soviet Union at the time. This resulted in the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. For Britain, the end of World War II ushered in the beginning of a post-colonial era, with the creation of Israel and Palestine and Jordan becoming an independent state. India and Pakistan became independent in 1947, as well as Sri Lanka and Burma the following year, and Ireland formally became a republic in 1949. Ghana became the first independent African state in 1957, and by this time, Prime Minister Harold Macmillan saw the writing on the wall, realising that an empire was no longer feasible for Britain, and the threat of communism spreading through Britain's colonies was a stark and imminent possibility. Macmillan conveyed this in his now famous Wind of Change speech, first in Accra, Ghana, and then in South Africa in 1960. I encourage you to listen to my previous podcast episode, Wind of Change Expanded, where I present my perspective and analysis of this speech, a speech that I believe conveys the understanding of the multi-layered complexities of human nature and our need to define our identity and interpret reality through aligning with an ideology and the consequences, good or bad, that this may bring. It is all simply a matter of choice. In today's current climate, I compare Macmillan's speech with the initial speech given by US President Joe Biden on the 16th of August 2021, when he justified his decision to pull out US troops in Afghanistan, explaining that it was time to bring to an end this forever war and it was never the US's intention to build a nation in Afghanistan. This is obviously US foreign policy that he had inherited over the past 2 decades. How he has gone about withdrawing troops is open for discussion and has come under intense criticism, but is this the writing on the wall for President Biden? An acknowledgement of the fact that actions have been so drawn out over the last 20 years that they have gone beyond their original intentions. We now live in a world where technology creates a contradiction. The consequences of our actions can be so far away, but one click of a button can erase the distance of miles and kilometres and bring any opponent or enemy face to face. Before I end the second part of this podcast duo, I'd like to leave you with some key questions. Will tribal factions in Afghanistan ever be able to reconcile on an agreed ideology which nurtures equality and prosperity for everyone and build a legitimate government that can lead the country into a stable and brighter future? What is the future for the youth of Afghanistan as we see the only nation that they've ever known disappear before their very eyes? What will their future look like? How will we in the West, and particularly Britain, reevaluate our relationship with the US and other superpowers such as China and Russia today? And will Britain ever be able to address and repress its colonial tendencies? And finally, what kind of new politics is needed in order for international relations to be successful in promoting greater tolerance of differing ideologies and minimise the threat of extremism? If you liked this podcast, then stay on my website or this listening platform and check out my other podcasts relating to this episode, Wind of Change Expanded, where I share my analysis and perspectives about Prime Minister Harold Macmillan's speech for change, as well as provide a wider context on global history after World War II and what this meant for Britain's colonies. And also my episode A Moment That Changed My Life, where I recall and reflect on a significant event in my school life and how this led me to where I am today. Don't forget what I call the heart and soul of the Stories to be Told movement. My stories or poetic narratives, Caribbean Wind, Caribbean Rush, Nights at the Round Table, the Berlin Conference 1884 and Gone with the Wind, Macmillan's Speech for Change. They're all available on the website and on Amazon. All 4 titles are available also on storiestobetold.com, as well as our free sample promotion. The links are in the notes of this podcast. Well, the month of October is fast approaching and Black History Month in the UK is just around the corner. I'm excited because Stories to be Told, the podcast series, will be celebrating its first birthday, and we're planning something special, so I hope you'll stay tuned and look out for us on social media. Thank you so much for continuing to support these podcasts, and please comment, like and share using the hashtag STBTpodcasts. As always, it's a pleasure and a privilege to share my learning journey with you in this podcast series. History is a matter of fact or perspective. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you on the next page.